ask us not only to look at a greater number of parents and caregivers and patients, but they've asked us to look across the trajectory of the illness to see if the benefit-risk equation changes over time with loss of function and what that means. So we're heavily involved in benefit-risk phase 2. You have to think about where patients are these days. And there are days when I don't think I'd ever say out loud, I'm glad my sons aren't here, but I guess I'm never that. But I'm glad that I'm not put in this corner. Families right now believe that they have one shot on goal, just one opportunity to participate in a clinical trial. The clinical trials are 48 weeks. There's sometimes an extension phase and then analysis. It's 3 years or more of a patient's life. There are very narrow protocols here. We're talking about a 6-minute walk test. 300 to 400 meters is the inclusion criteria. We're talking about forced air climb, 7 to 10 seconds off the floor, and often a specific mutation. I can't even imagine living with that. And parents are in the corner to pick the best trial. I know it's an experiment, but in their head, the best trial with the greatest possible outcome to slow disease progression for their son. This is about benefit risk, but it is a horrible position to be in and a very difficult one. So we have to find ways to accelerate the delivery of good clinical trials that get at whether this drug works or not, whether it's safe or not, and understand that it's going to take way beyond 48 weeks for us to understand the full impact. We then have gone on, and we're spending about $1 million, which makes me shudder every time I say it out loud. But we formed an alliance with the Critical Path Institute, and we're now working with them because the idea here, as you've heard this morning, our project is called De-Risk, and this is to look at and assess all sorts of data elements so that we can understand the natural history and create a disease algorithm so that we can have clinical trials with outcomes that are meaningful to patients and at the same time are inclusive of patients within this population. So this is what we hope to do, and this is what we're working on. We've initiated this for about 6 months. I am hearing all the time it's going to take 2 or 3 years, and I'm wishing it would take yesterday, but at the same time we think this is really, really an important step for our organization, and our next step will be combination therapies before approvals. Just putting it out there. Thank you.
Pat, one of the survey you put up showed that I think that 92% of your respondents were of Caucasian origin.
Yes.
I mean, how can you? I mean, America's a very multicultural society, as we are in Britain. How do you reach out into the other ethnic communities?
So I think this is a difficult situation for all rare diseases because the social networking is a lot of people, and I won't say that they are all Caucasian, but we hear these very loud voices. So in our 10 certified centers now, we're reaching out and going out one by one into those centers and providing some support in the centers for them to interview patients who come in and encourage them to participate in Duchenne Connect, which is our registry, and encourage them participating in our benefit risk studies. So that is our next phase 2, is we want to make sure that we have a diverse voice.
Thank you. Questions from, yes, there, Richard.
Thanks for that. It's a very inspirational story. We've worked with your counterparts in the UK, and I've heard many of these points made over there. If you look across the different things you're interested in, one would be trial design, another would be the nature of the benefit sought, and another would be how benefit risk should be determined, another would be the length of trial design. Mm-hmm. So are you getting movement on all of those fronts, or is there stickiness either amongst companies or amongst regulators on points of substance?
We're getting movement on all fronts. Maybe different companies are moving on different fronts more rapidly, but we're getting movement on all fronts.
Thank you. One here, and then we'll move on to Anders.
Nigel Cook, Novartis. There's ways, obviously, to identify what's meaningful to a patient and then to build that into your clinical trial design. There are also very effective ways now to quantitatively measure patient preference so that you can build patient preference modeling and show the trade-off between different parameters, and also risk-benefit analysis. Now, assuming that's done appropriately from a pharma company's perspective, working together with the patient organizations to do it in an appropriate way, do you consider that an appropriate way forward? And most importantly, the regulators, the payers, the HTAs in the room, are they willing to take that on board when they're making their decisions?
Well, I can't say for sure because we don't have any decisions that have been made, but I can say that that is our framework moving forward. We are including industry, patients in this discussion, and we are including payers. But I don't have any evidence to show you. We have an AdCom coming up with one particular drug on the 24th of November and another one on January 22nd. So I'm hopeful to report back to you that, in fact, we were able to make the case for both of these drugs to be approved.
Thank you very much, Pat. And now, Anders, if you'd...
Thank you. Thank you, Alistair. Thank you very much for inviting me here and coming over the pond from Europe to America and to talk about these important issues here. Our organization, European Patient Forum, is now in 12 years old, unites EU patient organization to ensure a strong and influential voice in the EU health and society policy. Collaboration is our leitmotif. It is rare that one single player in healthcare system can ensure better health outcomes in isolation. But we say it so often, cynics might suggest that it has come rather a cliche. In reality, it's more important now than ever. In a climate where we are striving to ensure a balance between real innovation and solidarity, ensuring access and equity to high quality but sustainable health and social care models, and many societies and citizens are still weathering the impact of economic crisis. We believe that patients are not simply a problem to fix, but can really be part of a collective solution towards better health outcomes and ultimately a better society for all. Key to this is patient empowerment, and we launched our campaign on patient empowerment in May this year, together with health professionals, academias, policymakers, industry and patient leaders who all helped to shape the campaign. Entitled Patient Prescribe. Patient Prescribe. It provides the concepts, the tools, the evidence, and the energy to ensure that patient empowerment is embedded as a key strategy towards sustainable health system. It has three tenets. First, quality information to patient and health literacy. Second, a new dialogue between patients and their trusted health professional. And thirdly, self-management. The uptake of the campaign by health professionals and their societies, by policymakers and key thought leaders bodes well. Our goal is to have a European strategy on patient empowerment to move forward on this approach in a coherent, measurable, and effective way. Linked to patient empowerment is, of course, patient engagement, alongside other stakeholders in the innovation process, regardless of what that innovation is. Systems innovation, social innovation, technological innovation, or therapeutic innovation. EPF is working collaboratively with many other stakeholders in driving this forward. Perhaps the best example of this is EUPATI, the European Patient Academy on Therapeutic Innovation. It is an unprecedented partnership between patients, science, and industry to ensure that patients have skills and knowledge about medicine's development that complements their own unique experiential knowledge as patients. Funded by the Innovative Medicine Initiative, EUPATI is providing state-of-the-art objective information and resources on the therapeutic innovation process in 7 key EU languages and in 12 countries, reaching at least 100,000 individuals before the end of the project. A certificate-level training course will mean that within a year we will have 100 patient experts ready to engage in the therapeutic innovation chain, from identifying research priorities to involvement in collection or of real-world evidence, as we will be discussing tomorrow. As we approach the final year of EUPATI, we are actually acutely aware that the Patient Academy is not an experiment or indeed a nice-to-do thing. We have a proof of concept, but the continuity of this program is essential to ensure that we have sufficient patient advocates who are able to bring forward their own expertise of the patient journey in the right context to generate real change for the benefit of patients and support the development of valuable innovation. Patient access is another key pillar of our work. We strongly believe in cooperation between stakeholders to improve patient access to healthcare. This is why, together with the National Patient Organization in Bulgaria, we co-founded the Patient Access Partnership. The partnership is a patient-led network that enables different health stakeholders to join forces to develop, to drive, and propose to the European Commission and European member states sustainable solutions to ensure equitable patient access to quality healthcare in the European Union. Stakeholders including industry, academia, and healthcare professionals are actively participating in delivering these solutions and ensuring that access remains high on the political agenda. Another key example of cooperation to advance on universal access to healthcare is the Riga Roadmap, an action plan to create sustainable, equitable, and participatory. It's an Italian word, isn't it? Participatory European health system. You wake up. That improve patient outcomes, which is supported by the public health community through EFPA, industry, and EPF. We have made strong political recommendations on equal treatment in healthcare in our position paper for healthcare for all, published in 2014. In 2014, we joined forces with 10 organizations to raise awareness on discrimination in healthcare on the occasion of the new Health Commissioners' hearing in European Parliament. In 2015, we have supported with various NGOs, including Doctors of the World and Platform for Collaboration with Undocumented Migrants, and EFPA, a common letter alerting health ministers on migrants' health and asked them to challenge EU and national policies on migration which undermine public health objectives, and use the tools available at European level to drive developments towards universal access to healthcare in the member states of the European Union. We believe that industry has a key role to play in improving patient outcomes and ensuring better, faster, and safer access. One example, among others, is our collaboration with the MedTech Europe, the association representing the medical devices industry. We have a memorandum of understanding, and we have established a dialogue between patient and industry representatives. Together, we have reflected on key themes like patient-centered healthcare and how to ensure health technology assessment is fit for purpose and really involves patients. The dialogue has delivered a checklist on pillars for patient-centered outcome and companies, which we believe, if implemented, would greatly help in ensuring innovation corresponded to patient need in this arena. Similarly, for over 10 years now, we have been part of the EFPIA patient think tank in order to have a place where patient leaders and company representatives can debate and discuss topics of common interest. And it's very clear that we will not always agree. Our perspectives are very different, and should be, but enhancing understanding and mutual knowledge has shown enormous values. We are living in as we heard today, in a very different times to 2010, 5 years ago. The patient role, expectation, and responsibility at both individual and at collective levels have transformed dramatically, as have advanced in medicine research and knowledge. A new consciousness, a new literacy among all the players around the table is key to managing this, with the right tools to ensure a supportive and enabling environment. This will foster not only collaboration, but real trust, valuing our tradition and heritage, but embracing a different mindset that also values patient empowerment and the patient's truly unique experimental knowledge, which can be enriched through true knowledge about the medicine's life cycle and competence to really engage as equal partners. We heard it before today, and I will mostly underline it. We are facing a new shift of paradigm, and that needs to be seen in action as well. Thank you very much.
Right, Anders, Upati, 100 expert patients across Europe, is this enough?
Absolutely. For Bulgaria. No.
So how are you going to scale up?
We're going to scale up. That's part of the deal. The deal is we understood that we have to deliver patient representatives who knows the patient journey, who is a true representative, not an intellectual representative, but a true one, who has the blood and the feeling in there and the patient journey. But they need to also be skilled. They need to have the knowledge and the language we heard and so forth. So we started this journey with Upati, with the Patient Academy. And so the 100 was the number first. Then we are now moving on. But then we're facing difficulties in the sustainable deliveries of this. So that is the discussion we are having now with IMI. Hello, Pierre. And the European Commission. Hello, Rox. And the industry wasn't here today, and FBI, but we will take them as well.
Thank you. Questions for Anders? In that case, perhaps I could ask our speakers to come and take their seats on these elevated chairs here.
Can we direct the movie now?
I think, yeah. Actually, what we will do is we will bring the bar out and put a pint of beer in front of each of you. So
Okay, well, that's
Love that.
I should say that Alison over there is tweeting furiously the content of today. So please make sure that any questions or comments are couched in 140 characters or fewer, because it will make her life much easier. Right, we've now got about 20 minutes to pick I think, a fascinating range of presentations which has covered a wide range of ground. Just to tie it in with the first session, Hans-Georg, you tellingly made the point that the drug that comes on the day of my funeral is not much use to me. But for patients with complex diseases, with progressive conditions, there are loads of little deaths along the way that can take things away. I mean, how can we, as it were, bring that recognition of urgency, of the need to move forward, further up the agenda? Go on, Marshall, you start.
I'll take a stab. One of the places is actually having patients involved in the process, because I think when we reduce this to a sort of a dry scientific regulatory environment, we want binary solutions to equations. We want something that's neat and orderly, that fits within a easily predictable pathway that we can quantitate. And life just doesn't work that way. Patients have ups and downs, and no two patients are the same, at least never in my experience. And the things that happen to the families really should have more of an impact. So I think bringing them into the process at an earlier stage in the development and design, I think can help sort of change that.
Yeah, Anders.
Of course I agree, but also that events like these are very important, because now this multitasking and multi-knowledge in the room, it's important to focus and to give that information. But then it's up to us from the patient organization and patient society to show, because if we show, and if you come with your son, and that shows it, then it's flesh and blood, and then it's creating a reality, and then I think showing that to the room and the various stakeholders, then it pushes. But it's very much up to the patient organization, I would say, as well, to shout and scream.
Well, I think patients are there from the beginning, right? Especially in rare diseases, because very frequently when you're diagnosed with a rare disease, your next step is to find out who's the best doctor and who's looking at this disease, who cares about it. And very often you'll find an academic, depending on how rare the disease is or how well known it is or perhaps how interesting it might be. So this academic is struggling often in rare disease without finances to complete his work or her work. So often the patient or family or advocacy organization provides that support. So they are exposed to what happens in the mouse or what mouse model they're using or what dog model. So we learn the whole zoo, if you will, of testing a particular idea or target and validating that target. And I think advocacy organizations and certainly patients pave the way. Often when industry comes in, then sort of a door goes down because what are you going to do with them anyway, right? They're just the patients. But I think it's really important to understand is patients need to be involved. They are from the beginning based on a diagnosis. They're going to be in the end because they're going to have to take this particular drug, navigate an insurance system that may not be simple, and in the US at least, pay something for it likely. So they're here, they're at the beginning and the end, so they deserve to be throughout this process. They deserve to understand what the target is, what you have to do to get from A to B, what you are trying to learn, what question you're asking in a phase 1, in a phase 2, in a phase 3. What is the process? What are the barriers? They need to be involved in the protocol. Patient-reported outcomes are important. For instance, in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, when we looked at that non-muscle targets, some of the parents said turning over in bed was important. It clearly wasn't in the patient preferences, but it might be to the parents because if you're up all night turning a boy from left to right and making him comfortable, then you might have been up all night. And I can imagine looking across the breakfast table, you're not really happy. And the day goes badly. You're tired, work doesn't go well, school. So I think patients need and deserve to be at the forefront throughout the development paradigm. Otherwise, I think that the industry is at real risk to fail.
Yeah. John, and then I'm going to go to Hans-Georg, and then...
As I heard yesterday, well, I hear every time patients, pain in the ass, and you never know what they're doing and whatever. But yesterday I was at the cocktail, and then I hear Bettina Rees saying one thing, and it was actually enlightening, like, bang, yes, true. Don't forget, a burden of disease or a disease is actually not stopping at what level of education. So she was saying like, well, we are looking for patients. We find them on the internet. That's what we do with Dipper as well. And these are English-speaking people that are obviously already have a certain academic degree because otherwise they couldn't do an eloquent talk on English. So wherever it comes from, patients are educated. So you find in every patient environment, you see academics getting patients, and then just say patients are just, let's do it like that. That's absolutely rubbish. So we should actually get patients involved and don't stop like patients at the one, well, I was a physician and then at once I became patient and at once they didn't talk with me but about me. So things like that are happening if you become patient, and we should really start taking the patient seriously. He's at an equal level as long as you find the right literacy patient. Of course we have bad habits, but...
Going to bring Hans-Georg in here, and then I'll go to Anders and Marshall.
About this urgency thing, Hans-Georg Eichler, EMA. I heard many of you saying there is a sense of urgency. We may have a different view of what level of risk we accepted, all that. Understood. Now, therefore, you come to us, the regulators, and tell us what you want and what your views are. Fine. So we try to respond with things like whether you call it breakthrough or adaptive pathways or all of this, doesn't matter. We try to hear you and to listen to you. The moment we do this, we get blasted by NGOs who are healthy people who are telling us they are protecting you against us.
Yes.
So, are you in a dialogue with those people?
Yes. I'm having this fight day after day after day with the so-called blunt idiots that are taking telling about my health, and now they are taking care about my position. and I want to shoot them. It's actually a little bit why I'm against patient advocates organizations that are ruled by academics, because the best knowledge of the burden of disease is with the patient, and he should fight against all those things. And the media, because they are they are not here, so they are actually the one that make the mistakes, because they're not here. We all make the mistakes. They are actually putting people in front of a camera that are not having this experience, and they are talking about how we should be protected. But that's a little bit the bias in the whole system. We're asking the wrong people, and we should ask the real patients, not patient advocates or patients that are only representing one person, their personal opinion. We should actually ask those people, how many people do you represent? Because the moment that you know that, how many people do you really represent of the whole population? You have the right to talk, and everything you say, that's very nice, but it's an individual thing. But no one is getting to that point. And yes, we should work harder on that one ourselves.
Anders or Marshall?
I was just thinking that I said that it's up to us, patient organization, also to push for urgency and push for development. But the structure must also be open. So then I'm very happy when I listen to Hans-Georg and the change of EMA is doing. It is little like what the industry did years ago when they said that now we have thrown out Taylorism within the system and bringing in lean production. What you said is that the EMA has thrown out the old-fashioned way of working. So that is great. And we need that from the Commission, we need that from IMI, we need that from all stakeholders and also from industry, that the structure must also be open and embracing us when we are coming and pushing for this. So that's why events like this are important.
Marshall.
I'm going to agree with what was said, but also, too, it's the same thing at FDA. We yell, push, 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 faster, faster, faster. The second something goes wrong, who gets thrown under the bus first? It's the FDA regulator. That's why I think it's probably one of the worst jobs to have. We have to stand beside on this. We have to assume that risk. And as you know, society's evolved into a very risk-averse. If something bad goes wrong, there needs to be someone to blame. And unfortunately, with a lot of these diseases and conditions, bad things happen, no matter what you do. And sometimes you may make them worse without meaning to, just by trying to fix them and do them better. And if we don't accept the responsibility for that as a societal level, we're not going to really move anything forward. Otherwise, we're asking you to take a risk that we're not willing to support you in. And that's not right. You just can't do that. The other thing I was going to say, just real quick, is from the physician standpoint, too, the rare disease field is kind of unique. I have to go to at least 2 or 3 meetings a year with the family organizations because we have our meetings together between our scientific groups. And those folks are in my face saying, okay, you said you were working on this last year. Have you got the data from that experience? I mean, they actually know what we're doing at the bench, and they're saying, okay, is your new tech got the machine working so you can actually get this done now? There's a level of accountability and that degree of interaction I think may be missing from other areas of medicine and research. So it's a definite partnership. It's a little bit intense sometimes, but I think it's definitely a productive partnership.
Thank you. Yes, gentleman here. 140 characters, remember.
As panel, and probably I will be not popular in this panel particular, you should admit that you are lobbying organization. Patients' organizations are acting as a typical lobby. On the other side, in the societies, in the state, in the hands of who are distributing money is a certain sum of money. So if we will spend a lot of one side, let's say rare diseases, we will not be able to fund those very simple things, dying from appendicitis, bleeding, ulcer bleeding, or something else. How you feel about this? Are you correct? Is everything there good?
Since I benefit from some of that funding, let me make 2 points. First is rare diseases teach us more about common diseases than anything else. First genes mapped in Alzheimer's disease were mapped because of the study of Down syndrome. When you look at infectious diseases, you can even make the points there. Yes, the pie has a certain finite quality to it. It does. And I can't do equal funding for all 7,300 rare diseases from that. But as a group, it's a huge group. And inevitably, it's always one of those things that we always learn something that we're able to carry back home. From treating rare urea cycle disorders with hyperammonemia, we've learned things about hepatic encephalopathy that could help out the 4 million folks with chronic liver disease. So it's always a trade-off.
Yeah. Quickly, Pat.
Sure, and I think you're right. We do lobby. We do for more funding. But in general, at least in the U.S., you can't do disease-specific lobbying because it won't work. So, and we know the applicability of broad funding. So we're always lobbying to support NIH, lobbying to support the Department of Defense. And I think also you have to recognize it's not all rare diseases. Duchenne, at least in my experience of Duchenne, it's been around a very long time, but it's taken 20 years to get to this point in Duchenne. So I think that also is drawing all boats in terms of neuromuscular disease. Every single one of the 9 neuromuscular diseases are already making progress, are already having biorepositories and registries and moving forward into trials with industry involvement. So I think it is utilizing the ones that are moving the fastest, that we can understand, perhaps that we have the most understanding of now, and trying to pull all rare diseases. I share with Marshall a real responsibility for rare diseases, and so the models we create, benefit risk, our certification process, it's all widely shared.
Yeah, a couple of people are keen to ask questions, so if we could just quickly move on. We'll take you were next in line, and then we'll take Ruxandra as the final question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Stella Blackburn from Quintiles. I'm an ex-regulator, a pharmacoepidemiologist, and most importantly, a patient. I know how important it is to listen to the patient's voice. I want to listen to the patient's voice. But which voice should I be listening to? Because even with rare diseases, you may find at least 6 or 7 different organizations all claiming to be the patient's voice for that disease. How can we bring the various voices together so that we're actually listening to the patient's voice?
You cannot.
Anders, you...
Yes and no. Yes and no. We have that discussion in Europe at the moment to what characterize a patient rep. What should you fulfill in order to have the right to say that I represented patients? And that discussion is going on in Europe at the moment, because there are different organizations that claim that they are patient organizations, but maybe they are not particular. So that discussion is going on. So you're right in that. When it comes to in Europe, European Patient Forum was formed for that purpose. Then the European Commission invited all the umbrellas in Europe to create the umbrellas of the umbrellas. So EURORDIS, rare diseases, is one of the members of EPF. So we are becoming in that, we are a political party. We don't defend one particular disease. We are fighting for that the disease-specific organization should have room. Coming back to the funding, I think we patient organizations, we will never accept to be put against each other in all this when it comes to funding, rare or not rare, what it is. But in the new time we are seeing, the new paradigm we are shifting now, we also need to look into the funding of NGOs like patient organization. How should that look like? That kind of discussion is not going on particularly well, and I think we need to speed up that so that the strongest lobbyists shouldn't be just for one disease. There also need to be other variables in this.
Thank you, yeah. Ruxandra.
So I think that every one of you in the panel, Hans-Georg, the colleague that just asked the question, talked about the communication. I think that all of us are doing a great deal to integrate the point of view of the patients. We are the patients, or we will be the patients, or we are the parents of patients. So we are all very much involved. But I think that we have not succeeded in our communication strategies. From your point of view, what should we do more, both on your side as patient representatives and then our side? I'm from the Commission, probably other colleagues are here from what would be a governmental organization, not the NGOs.
Marshall, do you want to?
I have one thing that I've observed in the States, and I don't know the extent of this in Europe. We have a lot of regulations trying to make sure that no one is conflicted in their position with something else. Unfortunately, that also tends to shut down communication. So, for instance, I was asked recently to sit on an FDA panel. There were 48 forms to fill out. And I actually then could no longer have communication with a patient organization that I was working with, and I couldn't do this and that and that. And I was laughing with the person who had asked me because she knew that this was what was going to happen with that. And I think we need to seriously look at some of the regulations we put in place. And I think, sunshine is the best answer for these things. Sunshine is definitely the best answer. But we need to make sure that we haven't straitjacketed ourselves in our communications.
John, you?
Yeah, we should look much more to other ecosystems that are doing a much better job. And if I look into social media, we started 1 year ago, looking how to make this better because we are not reaching out. We only have 2 to 8% from all patients in patient organizations, and all the other people are not connected. So this is where we as a DIPA started to take up the bridge by just going by the member states and bring there, like North, bring that organization that were in need for a certain thing, and then have a deliverable, a very clear deliverable also for the pharma industry, that you say like, well, they need this patient, how to bring that. And we started to work on that. But we learned from Google, we learned from Facebook. But that was not yet new media that were in place. So this is work in progress, and we're doing things. And no, I'm not lobbying. I'm just taking the best practice to the table and start working. That's what we do with POSI. We are start working. We are coming on this kind of panels. I never ask for any money because our stakeholders have the money. We just want to make sure that things are getting to work. We did the research, we did the innovation. Now it's time for the implementation, and that's where we are working on.
Pat, very quickly.
So 2 things. One is about communication. I think that we've established a very good relationship with the FDA, and we have this bi-directional communication because even as we do benefit risk, we want to know, is this meaningful to you? Is this what you're looking for? Does this make sense? Have we done it wrong? Should we ask different questions? So I think this is a bi-directional communication that has to happen. With regard to Duchenne muscular dystrophy in the United States, there are 46 foundations. They have different expertise, different abilities, different interests, different targets in terms of what they're interested in or not. But I think in the rare disease community, at least in Duchenne, if it matters, we're all together. We developed guidance together, 170 people. We're in our community advisory board representing all 46 foundations. We did benefit risk, all of them joined in. So when it matters, when it's carefully explained that this is important and this will drive the field forward, we can come together. We're still going to have diverse interests about what we think could or should be done or how we make money. But at the end of the day, we all have the same view, is that we'd like the quality of life changed for the people we care about.
Yeah, thanks. Anders, very quickly.
I'm good with the communication on the level we are now, but I want to move up in the food chain. In Europe, I would like to have direct contact with the council. I've said it before, but we are not allowed into the council. The council is a member state's government. We need to move up in the ladder. When it comes to the pharma company, we need to embrace your board of directors. We need to move up. But at the level we have now, I think the EMA and the European Commission is great. But up the food chain.
Good. Well, thank you. I'm, as you will have gathered, a Brit, and we have a royal family who have very little power at all. But representing on the panel, we have some of the royal family from patient organisations. Now, I'm going to ask them if they were king or queen for a day, and there was one thing, one piece of low-hanging fruit that you could pick that would really make a change, that would improve the health outcomes for patients with complex, life-limiting diseases, what would you do? Anders.
Starting with the king. I think that that's not an easy, the lowest hanging fruit is the shift of the paradigm again. It's so serious. It's so important that we put energy and task into that. So if I would be king of the day, I would call in all the stakeholders who are doing and having this power to do this change of the paradigm. And to change, we need to change the culture, the organization, the funding, and for that we need to change and exchange the understanding. But we are in that position now. We have talked enough about that patient has to be in there, must be in there, blah, 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 blah. We have to move it on to action now, and that is a shift of paradigm. That is what I would do as a king, and after that I would resign.
Abdicate, I think, is the technical term.
I'm a paid king, so that I resign.
I'll settle for a minor earldom or something like that. If I had my magic wand and I could wave it and do something specific, so I'll actually try to be specific here. I would actually change U.S. regulations around informed consent so that once an informed consent document is done for a study, it's good at all the institutions that could potentially use it. So that we're not, that I lose more junior faculty to that in frustration and getting out people who could contribute and move research forward. We don't get access to patients because we can't go to every institution and do informed consent documents there. So it's a technical fix, but one that I think could have some fairly wide range.
Thank you. John.
I'm in your kingdom. But good. On that one day, everyone will have access so that we have knowledge management, so that there is interoperability, and we actually know where the best practice is. Because right now it is there, but we don't know it. So if we can get those information, those knowledge at every place, that it would actually make a lot of people stay alive and not die because we didn't know it.
Yeah. Your Majesty.
Oh, gee. Wow, I have to tell my husband. So I've joined their circle. I think also we need to, in addition to cleaning up the informed consent and making it more rational and more usable, I think we need central IRBs. I think we need centralized contract negotiation. I think we need to have then the ability to understand that this is a benefit-risk equation on the part of each family in the presence of their clinician and whatever approved options they have to choose from. And I'd also like the FDA to sort of raise the curtain and tell us how you make decisions, what was incorporated into the decision-making process. Did you have benefit risk? How did you weigh it? Did you have patient-reported outcomes? How did you look at it? What was the comprehensive data set to include all those factors that made you make a decision, yes or no, so that patients have that understanding about what was finally approved or not, and why?
Well, thank you all very much, and thank you for participating in this conversation. Yes, lunch is available at the back. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. If I could just take a few minutes to introduce Nancy Berg of ISPOR, who's one of the sponsors of today. She'd just like to have a few words with you about ISPOR. We're very grateful for ISPOR for sponsoring the lunch. So it's my pleasure to introduce Nancy Berg, who will have a short presentation on ISPOR, and we appreciate your attention. Thank you very much, Nancy.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm a little bit relieved that I wasn't the speaker immediately before lunch, because I don't have one of those jokes that people tend to tell about being the only speaker between them and lunch. And I was also concerned that people might think that I would be speaking for an hour, because on the program it did say 1 hour, and that scared me too, frankly. I wasn't prepared for that. So I'm going to just get to the point, to talk very briefly about the ISPOR organization and why we sponsored this program. It has everything to do with collaboration and discussing our established networks and inviting participation as we at the ISPOR organization work to advance the knowledge of and the use of health economics and outcomes research in healthcare decision making. ISPOR has been, I won't say a sleepy organization, it's a very active and it's a very dynamic organization, but we've been doing a lot of things that we haven't spoken about. So in a way, they're sort of hidden. We're an organization of individual members based in Princeton, New Jersey. We had a beginning about 20 years ago. This year we're celebrating our 20th anniversary, but our beginnings were with the formation of a group by Extry. And now I'm pleased to say that we are a very large organization with a global footprint. It's actually a global network of almost 18,000 members from around the world, and they're representative of all of these stakeholder groups that I'm showing on this slide. And as we spoke today about the importance of all these different stakeholder groups meeting together, I invite some of you to take a look at our website and to learn a little bit about the ISPOR organization, because, for example, in our organization, we have strong constituent groups from the research and academic community, from industry and other producers, policymakers, regulators, payers and providers, and patients. We have a very well-established HTA network that operates in Asia, in Latin America, in Europe, and in North America. These groups meet at least once a year in a roundtable format. If there aren't HTA agencies in all parts of Asia, for example, then we have Ministry of Health leaders participating. And these groups are multi-stakeholder groups, stakeholders, and these are groups where we would welcome participation from many other organizations. We're also pleased that we have an infrastructure in 90 countries around the world. So while we haven't been, for those of you from the United States, for example, we haven't been that active in some of legislation and other activities in North America, because we've been evolving this dynamic global footprint that is involved in policy and education and training and discussions on HEOR topics around the world. We are starting our 21st year with a new strategic plan that has 4 pillars focused on our member engagement, education and training, and then the 2 pillars that we're going to focus on for the next couple of years. We're going to be focusing on scientific and research excellence. In other words, better science, better health. I love the tagline of this conference. I wish that we would have thought of it. And so scientific and research excellence by advancing more of our good practice guidelines and reports, and really using communication and collaboration as a major platform for building relationships with other associations, with governments, and with all types of organizations that have similar stakeholders. Because as we've heard many times here this morning and throughout other groups, there's been a big call for we need to do something, someone needs to do something, and we all continue to talk about it. It's good, Dwayne and Barbara, that there's going to be a summary of this meeting. I think it's a good start, and we're doing similar things at ISPOR. To show you the growth of the organization, it's been quite dynamic. In associations based in North America, many are not growing. So we're in a situation where the technology and the science that we represent is more important than ever, and this is reflected in the global growth. The growth of our international organizations are reflected in the lighter turquoise line. These are significant chapters of the organization that are evolving to help, as I said earlier, support the advancement of education, training, and policy. So we have a good network of organizations established. We have a very powerful international membership that's made up of 18,000 individuals. Again, not company memberships. We do not have company memberships within the ISPOR organization. And we're very pleased to be here today sponsoring the luncheon. It's a great opportunity for us to speak with stakeholders that are our members as well as our future members. That's how we look at it, because we all have a common mission of improving health globally. Our focus is on the advancement of health economics and outcomes research. Very pleased to be here. Thank you for opportunity. And if I were queen for the day, I would wish everyone a very good conference, and I know that it'll be productive for all of us. Thank you.
Okay, hello, check, 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 check. Check, 1, 2, 3, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sure we're all networking. And the last thing you want to do is hear me tell you to stop networking, but I am going to, because it is my prerogative. And I am moderating the next session. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. If we can get started, the next session's getting cracking on. And I'll be moderating the session. Good afternoon, my name is Dwayne Schultes. I'm the Managing Director of Vital Transformation. I'd like to thank you all for being here today. The next session we're going to be discussing are new data models, managing uncertainty, and leveraging new sources of evidence. A lot of the discussions we've been having today this morning revolve around the evidence package about coming to market earlier, usually around phase 2 if we're discussing breakthrough designation. Just a couple months ago, there was an oncology drug that came to market in a one-arm trial with 137 patients, phase 2. And so we're seeing indications coming to market much, much earlier. So in order to be able to do so, we're going to need to be harnessing new levels of evidence and being able to harness this data for better decision making. So we've been doing some work, and I'm just going to walk through some of the research we did last year in real world evidence. Just a couple slides, not too much. But we used two databases. One was the CPRD database in the United Kingdom, which is general practitioner data, which is run through the MHRA, the TrialViz platform. And the other one is the Oracle Health Sciences Network, which is 2.5 million patients covered through Penn Medicine. Now, we did a couple extractions in this database. We did one in Alzheimer's disease, where we set up a clinical trial query and exclusion-inclusion criteria, and we extracted data from the databases, and they responded roughly about the same, about 10 or 30 per 10,000, which is what we'd expect to see, give or take 20% variance. But look what happened in cardiovascular disease. From the GP databases, we had 130,000 responses, yet from the hospital data, from the Oracle Health Sciences Network, we only had 900 responses. So that caused us some great consternation. Why did we have such a huge variance in the data set? Well, when you start digging into the data, you find out why. It's because the CPRD, as I mentioned, is GP data, general population data, whereas the Penn Medicine database it's a teaching hospital. And as you can see here, if you look at the cholesterol ratios, the LDL ratio on CPRD, we had 75% of the patients that were excluded. But if you look at Penn Medicine, the hospital data, we excluded 97% of the patients in that first extraction. So what this means is when we're looking at real-world evidence and we're looking for harnessing this data to make better decisions, we have to be very careful and very conscious about how we're leveraging this evidence and how we're attracting these new sources of evidence, because not all databases are the same, not all interpretations of data will be the same. GP data, obviously, you don't go to the hospital every day if you're on Inderal, if you're on beta blockers, or if you're on statins. Obviously, we're going to get a more rich data source than we would at a hospital, a much more advanced disease state for cardiovascular disease. This has a huge implication for the research work we're going to be doing and how we're bringing drugs to market going forward. So with that, we have 4 serious experts. I mean, this is a really fantastic panel. So we have Sabine Aztor, who's currently seconded to the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, EFPIA, but she's actually in her other hat, she works for Roche. And I'm going to invite Sabine to the floor representing EFPIA today. Sabine, the table is yours. Thank you.
Shall I move here?
You can do whatever you want, sure. Here you go.
Okay.
All good?
Okay. Thanks a lot, Duan, for the nice introduction. We heard a lot of presentations this morning about data generation, real-world evidence, and it's very clear data generation and evidence collection is changing radically and drastically. And we have, with biomarker-driven research, come to a point where we have an unprecedented knowledge of the diseases. And the diseases, especially in the oncology sector, we are aware that a number of diseases can be identified with biomarkers, and therapies can be assigned accordingly. Now, this drives a change of paradigm on how we conduct clinical trials. The classical randomized control trial will be probably more and more belong to the past. We will have more trials, which marker research-driven development, in particular basket trials and umbrella trials. Basket trials are trials which look at different, same tumor in different organs, identified with the same biomarker profiling and therapied with the same molecule, the same drug. In umbrella trials, we have the same tumor in the same organ, identified with different biomarkers and therapied with different medicines and combination medicines. And these types of trials have already started. They bring in a number of new complexities and new experiences, both by regulators and the companies, and we will have to learn along the journey. So this is one part of evidence generation. Another part of evidence generation and data generation clearly links to genomic data and the possibility to identify and target disease therapies with next generation sequencing. So we will step away from this traditional model of tissue biopsies and move more to liquid biopsies with multiple testing possibilities, including next generation sequencing and imaging. This will allow us to have continuous data collection over time, not only during the phase of the preparation of a package for an application for marketing authorization, but also later on. The genomics era is also acknowledged heavily by the politicians, and as probably most of you know, Genomics England is looking at 100,000 patients and exploring the possibilities to use them in healthcare therapies. Now, wearables, mobile tools are the other element of new data generation and data collection, and this starts from conducting clinical trials where these tools are increasingly be used and pose a number of new questions on how to deal with this from a scientific and a regulatory perspective. And in Europe, this is particularly relevant as we do have clinical trials conducted in different companies across borders, and the use of wearable tools may imply also a trend for remote conduct of clinical trials with investigators far away from the patients. And this, of course, brings challenges in Europe with the different borders and languages, something we need to look at in the future. But also post-authorization of a product, the data collection with wearables is going to be an important element of the future scientific development, and we will have to see how this will be reflected in the ongoing evidence generation and confirmation of the benefit risk after authorization. Now, how to address all these evolving concepts which happen at the same time, which are coming at certain limits between in Europe, between the European perspective and the national perspective. Now, medicine's adaptive pathways is certainly a concept which looks at the possibility to integrate these new evolving concepts as part of a life cycle development approach for a drug. So instead of looking at this magic moment of the authorization where all data have been collected, it will look at evidence generation over time, including real-world the new toolkit. The radical change from adaptive pathways compared to the current system is the integration of a number of stakeholders around the table. Whereas in the past we had this traditional exchange, regulators and industry, in the future we should have HTA bodies around the table, and of course the patients as well, eventually even at a certain point the payers. Now, looking at the processes, MAPS is not really a completely new thing. It is intended to connect existing regulatory tools, but also access tools, and the stakeholders acting in the space at the interface of continuous and integrated evidence generation, regulatory assessment and approval, and finally access. And when you look at the tools, we have a number of systems in place already. We have a number of systems in place already which support timely access of medicines, starting from the traditional scientific advice system, which is evolving into a parallel scientific and HTA advice, the new priority medicine scheme, which actually has just been launched for public consultation yesterday. And this is a scheme which is based on iterative steps of scientific advice to support an early and continuous dialogue between the companies and the European Medicines Agency through its Scientific Advice Working Party to foster early development and come to conclusions and a better design. In the assessment, we have the possibility to accelerate the assessment from 210 days to 150 days. We have rolling reviews applied in exceptional situations such as pandemic vaccines, where it was applied in the past. We have the system of conditional marketing authorization, which is addressed to come to an early approval on the basis of less data in situations of unmet medical need. And then we have, of course, the traditional system of a full marketing authorization, which now can be made subject to specific conditions, and these can include post-authorization efficacy and safety studies as an example. So all these tools are there. We have also tools in the area of access, such as relative effectiveness assessment, looking at the application of the product, the medicines, in comparison to standard therapies, which are then used as a basis for decision by payers. Now, it is important to see how the combination of these tools can be better harnessed. And with this in mind, the EMA has started to look at the revision of the application of the existing tools, in particular the conditional marketing authorization and the accelerated assessment. And we see a trend for a stronger dialogue at an early point of time between the regulators and the industry. And we see a trend for a stronger flexibility in discussing around the scientific endpoints and scientific markers. So there's clearly a very positive trend on a better combination of what we have today, and at the same time bring the stakeholders around the table, the regulators, the HTA bodies, the patients. MAPS is also about connecting the dots. And as I said at the beginning, the trend is there. We are looking into E and M health possibilities, but at the same time in Europe, we see responsibilities at a national level and at a European level, which need to be mitigated and also considered. Next-gen sequencing, new clinical trial designs, patient involvement, which is currently being discussed with a new project in IMI on patient elicitation for benefit risk assessment, but also other areas touch upon adaptive pathways such as big data and real-world data. And here we have the element of data protection, which plays an important role. So the use of big data will only be possible if indeed the consent given by the patient for their data will be broad enough as to allow secondary use of data. And that is something which is really a serious point now in the debate of the new, EU data protection regulation in the Council and the Parliament. And it's the moment where this point really needs to be finalized and hopefully will work into the direction that secondary use will be possible. If this will not be sorted out at an early point in the regulation now, we will have a real problem. So we still have some hopes that this will be successful. But also the other areas need to be considered, and it's important that with any discussion on maps, we make sure that we have not the traditional siloed discussions, but the connectivity across the topics and across the European and the member states level in the future. And that is a particular European challenge we have to deal with. And here we come to IMI. IMI as a public-private partnership, as presented by Pierre this morning in all details, provides that unique opportunity to break these silos in Europe. And we must make sure that we properly use the funds available, the system is there, that we bring these important topics which touch on medicine's adaptive pathways to IMI to sort out the discussion between the stakeholders needed for the debate, both at the European level and at the national level. And here in particular, it will be very, very important that we get on board not only the industry and the regulators in the traditional setting, but also more and more the patients and the HTA bodies. We have a number of projects in the pipeline right now which have touch points with adaptive pathways. The IMI Adapt Smart as a discussion platform to identify further research and enable the implementation of adaptive pathways has just been launched. Other projects are on the horizon, the one on patient preference elicitation for benefit risk assessment, a project on real-world data, GetReal, is up and running for quite some time. A lot of results from that project can be harnessed for this adaptive pathways discussions, and we will certainly see more projects as a result of IMI Adapt Smart very soon. And with this, I would like to hand over.
Thank you. I should add that collectively, Adapt Smart and GetReal we're often just referring to as Get Smart, just to cut to the chase. Now, Sabine, you mentioned under PRIMES there's an iterative step of scientific advice. Mm-hmm. So generally now you get scientific advice when you apply, and that's it. So how would, from the industry, steps of scientific advice work? What would you like to see, and how do you think it's going to be structured?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that question. That's a very good question. Of scientific advice, we understand as a solution to that need to have a more continuous dialogue. So there will be specific processes. So for each question, a scientific advice will have to be requested, and a response will come then from the agency, but we will have a possibility to apply more of these scientific advices as part of the development of the medicines. But maybe Hans-Georg can also elaborate a little bit further on that.
He looks thrilled.
He knows the concept much better from the agency perspective.
He's a man hunted near extinction today, I'd like to point out.
What was the question?
PRIMES iterative scientific advice. How do you see that working under PRIMES, the iterative scientific advice?
Well, basically, we always said PRIME is not about an evidence standard. PRIME is about how can we better interact with the pharmaceutical companies. So what we hope to see is more frequent interactions to guide you through and learn from you, maybe look at what has changed, how do you need to change course. And again, we're hoping to do this not just with the regulators, but also with the other decision makers in the room. Does that answer the question?
Fantastic, of course. I wouldn't say anything else, would I?
And
By the way, for those of you who aren't Americans, that buzz is a vote. So when you hear the buzzing, they're going in for votes. That's all that is.
And Duane, Prime has been set up very broadly for the time being as to learn over time. Not to come with a very detailed process, but with a broad concept which allows that products for which an early dialogue is really needed can make it through the process. And we think this is a really smart approach as opposed to being very detailed or restrictive. So we very much welcome that approach, this concept learning over time. What is also important from our perspective is to have that early understanding on who is going to be the rapporteur in the process. Right. So that allows for a better planning and preparation from the industry perspective. The other element which is important to us is linked to HTA. We understand that the whole HTA element is not specifically part of the Prime scheme because other initiatives are up and running to involve HTA into the dialogue at the agency, and the result of those needs to be awaited, for instance, SEED, the joint action, etc. But it is important that sooner or later these tools will be combined so that also HTA bodies participate to this discussion. The bottleneck is the resources with the HTA bodies right now, and this is something where we really need to think about and try to find a solution on how this can be addressed, because we have gone quite far in improving the system from the regulatory perspective, and what we have seen over the past year as an industry here is really a major step forward. We see the regulators try to maximize the existing system for the evolving and new science to come. But if the HTA bodies are not
there's no point.
Part of the story, we are not getting where we have to get. So now we have to focus on how can we manage to get the HTA bodies on board for that discussion.
I could probably talk for another hour with you, but we've got to move on. So I'm going to move to Kenoy, but thank you very much, Sabine. So now I'm going to bring, thank you. Kenneth Oy, Associate Professor of Political Science and Engineering at MIT. Ken, the floor is going to be yours. Thank you.
Is the slide advancer still here?
Let me. Okay. Macs are always supposed to be so easy. Sometimes I disagree with this assessment. Here you go, Ken. You are right there. There you go.
Okay. Slideshow.
There you go. If you want to use that.
What is the forward and back? Okay, got
it. There you go.
Okay. Great. A real pleasure to be following up on the sessions that have taken place to date. So the focus of this presentation is going to be on how do we enable better use of, and I'm using the expression real-world evidence, noting that it can cover a multitude of sins. In this case, I intend it in the broadest possible sense of the term. Now, okay, this slide has too many words. I know I've violated the prime rule of Microsoft PowerPoint. 3 lines, 3 words, no more. But there's a reason. The problem that we're dealing with is actually pretty complicated. So if you look at this slide, the question is first, on what issues do we have potential problems? And when we look at those issues, to what extent do we need common standards or rules, or can you handle it unilaterally? So we've had discussion of the need for interoperability. We all appreciate the fact that if we're running around in a world where indications are getting smaller and smaller, we have to be pooling data, whether that data be pooled across organizational lines within the United States or across international boundaries. If we're pooling data, then you better figure out how you're going to do it. And there's been a lot of work on this, CDISC and others, on categorization standards, data exchange standards, diagnostic criteria. Curation. Now, we don't usually think of curation as an issue of standard setting, but I think we ought to. We have a big problem. And the problem is that the healthcare records that we're talking about, along with the varieties of big data, are not always entirely accurate. I had an odd experience. I was admitted to the Massachusetts General Hospital, and for a heart problem that turned out to be a false alarm. It's always nice when there are false alarms, EKG, a lead that generated a Q wave, only one. But nonetheless, you're then sucked into the belly of the beast. And I discovered in the course of 10 minutes that there were major errors, starting with the fact that my last name was misspelled. That created a little bit of a problem. When we got that one settled, what were the problems? Early onset heart disease, family history. And I say, my father died of heart disease at age 93. Okay? Lipid profile, well, they got it wrong. Okay, let's just say that they got the numbers wrong, and I wasn't even in the inclusion criteria for statins. But nonetheless, okay, and it went on and on. Now, it was true that half the information was correct. But this leaves you feeling a little bit funny when you're going to be giving talks on things like the use of health records for all kinds of good purposes. Curation, meaning we need to actually figure out how we're going to be taking a subset of the data and actually figuring out if it's right, meaning that you might want to be doing follow-up tests to confirm results. You might want to be looking for odd values that are outliers as a trigger for further scrutiny. There are all kinds of things that are necessary. And discussion of curation, verification, confirmation is only in its infancy, but you might want to even be talking about setting standards for it. Allowed use. Now, okay, allowed use under what conditions? With IRB approval or with consent? And by the way, if we're talking consent, do we mean opt-in or opt-out rules? So I just came back from this meeting in Korea that I mentioned. And the Korean folks were driving themselves nuts because consent was defined strictly in terms of opt-in. And the Finns who were there were smiling because consent was defined in Finland as opt-out. And what was possible in Finland was not possible in Korea. Well, then move to allowed uses like, what are you really going to be using it for? And typically, and we found this in our NUDIGS work, talking with the guys that are running Mini-Sentinel, if you're talking about public health, the use of data for surveillance, for adverse effects, or surveillance for pandemics, go right ahead. You're free pretty much to do what you want. Limits, of course. Or if you're using the data for validation of surrogates, again, typically it falls under a public health exemption, so you don't need to jump through as many hoops. But we're talking about the use of data for other purposes. We're talking about the use of data potentially for research. So if we want to figure out effectiveness, not efficacy and safety, but effectiveness, comparative, that's not quite the same as a standard public health exemption, but it's close enough. You might be able to get away with it. But what about for drug discovery? So we could be using the data for purposes of, and we've talked about this part already, Hans-Georg mentioned the permutations and combinations. So you're doing drug discovery when you're finding out which combinations will work. But you could also be talking about drug repurposing. The idea that you're sitting around and taking already licensed drugs, drugs that have been in use, drugs that may be near generic or at generic status, and discovering second and third and fourth indications that they might be good for. That's drug discovery. It's not quite the same as standard public health. Or you could even be talking about the use of the data for recruiting into RCTs. We've had a lot of discussion in this meeting of the difficulties that are associated with gathering people to fill those tiny little niches that are defined in terms of 150 inclusion and exclusion criteria. And you're looking for confound or cleansed tiny little groups. It sure would help to be able to use the health records freely for recruitment in, and guess what? Depends on how you look at it. Some of the data and some of the arrangements might not be useful for that purpose by virtue of the purpose for which it's being used. Privacy. Well, okay, again, back to Senator Whitehouse and his remarks. Get stuff anonymized. We've gone a lot of the way, and it does make life simpler if you can do it convincingly. We know that there are practical problems associated with people who are running around, and MIT is filled with good people like this, hackers that are sitting there trying to figure out ways of de-anonymizing and anonymized data or identifying de-identified data. But even if you can do it, okay, do you want to is a question. Because many of the purposes that you may have in mind, if you want to be doing curation, for example, you better be able to contact people to check. Or if you're trying to recruit people into trials, anonymized doesn't exactly take you all the way to what you need. There also is another problem associated with privacy, data security standards. We have noticed 1 or 2 incidents of hacking of healthcare records. And all over the world, we have increasing attention to the possibility that the data that you gather may become available to many more people than you have in mind. And if you're talking privacy, part of it is privacy with respect to researchers, but some of it's with respect to hackers. Now, one little note on consent and privacy. The little note on consent and privacy is that you can get away with a lot if people aren't afraid. If people are not afraid of how the data will be used if it is released. What I mean by that is that if you are in a position where you believe that a leak of the data, a breach of your privacy will result in losing employment or losing disability insurance or losing life insurance, under those conditions, then the attention to privacy and the attention to serious forms of consent will be very, very strong. And it's always useful to look to other societies because they have the strictest regulations that I know of in terms of the use of, well, in particular genetic data, but others as well, in a manner that would be averse to the interests of the party. So I asked our Finnish expert, how upset are people about consent and privacy? And she says, oh, no, not much. And she said, oh, of course, you in the United States are crazy because you're so afraid of the government. We Finns have a benign attitude towards government. And then she added that because government and employers were barred from using the data in a way that would hurt you, people were not as worried about the use of the data. Hence, medical uses of the data, research purposes, all kinds of other things were much easier to do. Finally, ownership. I'm staring at Artie because this is what Artie will be speaking on. You have the issue of who owns intellectual property, who owns the data, but also who owns the tools that you're using to analyze it, and who owns the standards that may be generated to allow us to use the data more effectively. So the IP issues here are actually even more complicated than one might fear, and you have lots of different people owning bits and pieces of the stuff. Now, in the last 30 seconds, if you look at the bottom part of this, what's the scope of harmonization? We have all those issues sitting up top, and each of them is worth hours and hours of discussion. But it's not clear going in. You can't just say automatically we need global standards, or you need regional standards, or national. It's going to vary from case to case and issue to issue. One can imagine, actually, situations where you could be accommodating significant variation on perhaps privacy standards, taking account of the fact that different societies have different views on it. Okay. You might even have some situations where for some purposes and some dyads, pairs of actors or some groups, you might want to be really, really tough, far tougher than national or regional. I'm not going to be able to fill in that matrix right now. I'm recommending that we do this over the course of the next 5 years. But do not take it for granted that what we want to be doing in each of the cases is moving to global. In many instances, we don't need a standard. In other cases, maybe a national or even a group standard might work. So I've gone 10 minutes, and I will turn it back to Dwayne.
Thank you, Ken. Don't run away.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I think it's quite funny. You just made reference to the fact that in your perception is that Europe is much more open with the data.
No, I indicated
Finland.
Finland.
So,
okay. I want to be very clear.
Whereas if you look at what's been going on in the United Kingdom, the use of their national data has been a huge political scrum. I mean, absolutely brutal. And there are real issues there. From your perspective as a researcher, how do you see the need for data, and how do you define how you can obtain data? Where are you going for your data in research? Where are you finding the path of least resistance?
So, again, one size does not fit all. take the different purposes that we just ran through very quickly. And for some purposes, you may not need huge databases. You might prefer cleaner, smaller ones, okay? I mean, the point, and this is a very serious point, and it sounds vague, but it's not. One size does not fit all in terms of answering that very, very appropriate question. And you want to be looking to, are you using it for drug repurposing? Or are you using it to validate surrogates, the problem that we were talking about earlier in terms of it not happening maybe as quickly? Or let's use it for better understanding the effectiveness of drugs. Now, if you're talking about safety signals, then access to data, and I want it broad, and I want it really broad, in fact, but I'm also going to find that it's easier to gain access to broad sets of data for safety signals or pandemic surveillance.
Yeah.
Right? Why? You want to talk about public health, that really fits the definition.
Yeah.
But you also want it broad because sometimes you get weird little signals from interaction effects on drugs, and you don't necessarily want to be going with a tiny little cleaned up sample. Okay? For drug repurposing, you'd want to be focusing very, very clearly on clean data. And the game that you'd be playing would be along the following lines. You have really good quality health care records, I know, oxymoronic. And you're looking for patients that are getting a drug, having effect on the primary indication, but you're looking for patients with comorbidities. And you're looking for patients with comorbidities to see if the other one responds. And if it does, and you have enough of those cases, you've generated a hypothesis, but you want to do it systematically. This is sort of the way that it happens serendipitously, historically. But you want to do it much more systematically by going through the data, and then maybe moving to a focused trial to confirm.
Right. We're going to continue with that, I think, and we could, again, you and I could probably, we have for several hours, but we're not going to right now because they're here, unfortunately. Yes. We'll do this later.
Okay.
But I'd like to move to Bettina Rill. Bettina is the founder of the Melanoma Patient Network in Europe, a very articulate patient advocate who also is a researcher. So she approaches this from a scientific method as well. So it's our pleasure to have Bettina here. Thank you very much. You can't work this. I know it's a Macintosh. I know. They're supposed to be easier. You know that.
That was a theory.
Yeah, I know. There you go. Thank you, Bettina.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure here, and it's actually an honor to be able to provide a patient perspective on what might sometimes seem a very technical discussion. And I think Kenneth gave a very good example, just how something like curating data can get a very different meaning if you are the patient. And I would like to find first out how I can move my slides forward without standing here. I would like to give you a short perspective from my very specific standpoint, and I would like you to understand this in the context I'm coming from. So my background is, as Duane said, I have a medical degree. I studied medicine in Germany and in France, and then moved to the UK to do a PhD in molecular biology, where I met my later husband, who was from Belgium, and we moved to Sweden when I got a position at university there. So from that, you can conclude that I'm definitely European. Unfortunately, in 2011, my husband was diagnosed with metastatic melanoma and died of it a year later. And that was the reason or the motivation why I'm now standing here in front of you and why I, in 2013, founded the Melanoma Patient Network Europe. Melanoma is my main interest, but I do think that it has something to teach us because it can be used as an example case for a situation of high unmet need and dramatic therapeutic progress. And as a short summary about melanoma, we lose about 23,000 Europeans to it every year. It is a relatively young cancer. So my husband had just turned 36 when he was diagnosed. Just like the average, the median is something between in the early 50s, depending on the study you look at. And it's one of the most frequent cancers, or it's the most frequent cancer in women under 30. Incidence is rising, probably linked to sun exposure, so increasing number of holidays abroad. And it is a problem, an increasing problem for us. And I wasn't really aware of it until it hit us. But it is a nasty disease. It is like when you're diagnosed metastatic, on average, people had 6 to 9 months to live. So you go from a situation where you're planning a family, planning your career, to dying in less than a year. Luckily, The situation has changed dramatically because we have had not one but two classes of new therapeutics coming up. And I'm sure you have seen it because it was all over the news, and there is this very spectacular photo of a patient riddled with tumors who responds to one of these, namely a BRAF inhibitor, and where the tumors disappear and unfortunately come back afterwards. So for us, we have the specific situation that none of the therapies that we had before, namely radiotherapy and chemotherapy, ever showed any effect in melanoma. I still like to believe that I'm not that old. My daughter over there will disagree, but I learned already 20 years ago, nearly 20 years ago at med school, that melanoma is chemo and radio resistant, and that hasn't changed. So if you want a chance to live, you need these new drugs. Your chance to live depends on access to these drugs, who are unfortunately coming with a hefty price tag. And as a next problem, just getting this one drug is not enough, because we are not as lucky as hepatitis C patients today, where a single drug is actually able to deliver a cure. With these, our drugs of melanoma give hope, but they do not give a cure. So we are dependent on systematic learning and progress in order to come where we want to be, namely to keep our patients alive. So, early access. This is a typical advocacy topic. We want access to drugs. And then everyone goes, yeah, you're bought by pharma, and you don't know what you're talking about anyway, because think of all these risks. And this discussion has always, annoyed me beyond belief, because every single patient can tell you that the moment you are diagnosed, of basically everything changes. What matters in life, what is important to you, but also what is risk. And this is something that you cannot anticipate until you are there yourself in that situation. Now, in a situation where you know if you do not take anything, you will die for sure, a potential side effect of a drug takes on a very different format, because it is just that very drug that comes with a certain risk that could also prevent you from dying. And of course, someone from the outside will say, oh yeah, but it will come with side effects. And the discussion, I think, or that where we are turning is like that we assume that someone in this discussion must be right, and that there is such a thing as the single right answer to the issue. And I think this is where we go currently wrong. And I have this quote from a workshop, and this is a discussion we currently have with our oncologists, who are very reluctant to put people on new therapies that come with side effects, where our people want the therapies, and the oncologists say they are too dangerous. And then our patients go, try melanoma for a change. So why do I think this is important? I think we need an approach, and this touches upon a question that came earlier in this session before lunch. How do we get to whom do we ask? Who's representative? Who can tell us really what patients need? And how do we do it? Because the answer when this question raised, I think it's a very important question that we all have to solve as a community, because it is not simple. I find, from my perspective, that many other stakeholders have a quite simplistic concept, one could also call it naive, when they're demanding patient input. They would like to invite one person into the room and say, please tell me everything about the specifics of that very condition. And then they go, and how representative are you anyway? This usually happens short notice, because patient representatives are usually invited last, without any preparation, or you get something sent the day before, no properly formulated questions, no agenda, and no follow-up. This is a bit extreme, but I've been to a couple of these. And I think this is a situation that will not bring us forward, because there will not be a single person representing everyone and knowing everything. Everyone assumes if you want one KOL, you invite 5. You are not going to invite one regulator and say, talk for all regulators in this world. You're not going to find that. You're going to invite someone from the FDA, from the EMA, you're going to invite a Canadian, a Japanese, and probably some I've forgotten now. And I think we also have to start thinking about patient advocacy in these terms. We need specific input. And now I would like to run you briefly through how I think we should be doing it, because it's not about being right, me being right, you being wrong, or the other way around. I think we have to come to scientific measures, how we can actually measure differences in perception. This is a pilot project we ran together with the EMA, and we were very happy that we could run this at the last conference I organized, which was in April in Brussels, and that was called The Risk of Not Taking Risk, and addressed the different risk-benefit perceptions between patients and other stakeholders. Briefly, how it ran. It was a mathematician, a group in Holland, who developed a tool, and the tool allowed, independent of any specific product, to say, for an increase of in lifetime, I am willing to accept in adverse events. And the initial idea was to measure our conference participants and use a group of regulators as control group. So they let 70 regulators fill in this tool, and the original idea was just use everyone who attended our conference. So this came out. I want you to focus on the third box on each of them. On the left side, our conference participants, on the right side, the EMA colleagues. Now you would say this is not very spectacular. So you would expect patients and advocates to be a bit more risk-loving than regulators. I always say I would expect risk aversity to be a selection criteria to become a regulator. On the other hand, this is what we want them for, right? We want them to protect us from the mistakes of the past. So I think this makes total sense as a concept. Now what I find interesting, and this is very preliminary data that we want to use like as a baseline to do a proper study on it, but I find the tendency in there is very important, I think, and this is something I would like you to take home today. We did a subgroup analysis, and we actually tagged the surveys because we were not able to ask medical information in this context. So on the very left, you see stage 4 patients. So these are diagnosed stage 4 melanoma patients. In the middle, you have carers, most often spouses or siblings of stage 4 patients. And then on the right side, you have advocates, for example, working for an organization, taking care of stage 4 patients, but being neither a patient themselves nor a carer. So these could be stage 1 melanoma patients or people who are not related or have no personal contact to melanoma. And I think this is where it gets really interesting. You see that patients in themselves, and I put the red line as the reference line for the regulators in there, just so I have one figure because the original one was too long and I thought I'll be running out of time anyway. So I think you can see very clearly that the patients are the most risk-accepting ones, and that already the carers are not as risk-accepting as a patient would be. And what totally floored me were our advocates, who were even less risk-accepting than the regulators. And our problem is that it is often the group to the right who are the most vocal, the ones whose lives are not in danger. So they're the ones going around advocating for patients. And this is something that I think we all have to take very serious, because it just means you cannot take anyone claiming to be an advocate. You have to know how these people think and what their background information is. These numbers are statistically absolutely painful, so you cannot draw anything from that. But unfortunately, it confirms an impression that we had in our groups. It has started some big discussions, for example, about carers. I was a carer. It gives you pause for thought that you might influence your partner to do something that is more based on what you yourself feel, and it's not in their own interest. And now we would like to repeat this with our oncologists, because we expect a totally different perception of that. They were pretty shocked when we said that they're going to be the next control group. So I said, well, try to be a guinea pig. I do think this really helps, because if you can plot it, you have something to base your discussion on. It is not about you are right or you are wrong. It is about we are different, and this is the level in which we differ, or to which degree we differ. And how do we come to a decision that is fair on each side? Because we all have something at stake, and someone said it earlier on. If the FDA makes a wrong decision, who gets punished? It is the people at the FDA. We can't work like this. We need a ground. And also about the decisions we had, just like Hans-Georg said that earlier on. We approve a drug, and then some patient group says is like, you are endangering us. I think if we start basing our decisions on data, on solid data, where we can prove we have asked patients who are the ones whose lives are at stake, we are able to bypass this discussion on a scientific basis. So for me, solid science is the way out of this dilemma. So this was the first point of this session, which was called uncertainty. So I think we need a smart approach to measuring to be able to for a basis as baseline for good discussion. The next one is new sources of evidence, and how do we think about evidence? Now, as a patient, access to these drugs as melanoma is essential. So originally it was access in trials. So finding the right trial and getting into the trial, including exclusion criteria, were crucial for us. Now with these drugs moving through lifetime cycle, and by now being approved, access on HTA and reimbursement has become, at least in Europe, a big issue. So for us, data and knowing how to get through these drugs is extremely important. And to me, like real-world data or other sources of data actually is the other side of the medal to early access. I do believe that early access alone is not going to fix our problems. If you take a new promising drug and let it alone out in the wild, we are not learning, and this is something I mentioned very early on. As a patient, if you have a drug that gives you hope but no cure, this single one is not going to help you. So you're relying on a process of systematic data gathering. And this is how my original interest in adaptive licensing actually started, because I think that is, from my perspective, a very attractive way of ensuring continuous learning. Now, as a patient, if you decide which medicament or which drug you would like to take or which trial you would like to go on, you want to find data on how much the population it was tested in reflects yourself. Which comes to the next problem, namely RCTs, which randomized controlled trials, which for everyone who has ever gone through any type of medical, pharmaceutical education has been sold to us as the holy grail of to solve all our problems, basically. I remember very vividly when I was sitting in pharmacology that in my third year at med school, where we had just started seeing our first patients, and where you're very aware that your own lack of knowledge could endanger another human being at some point, I remember how much I appreciated learning about RCTs and evidence-based medicine, and I thought, this is the way to protect others from my own lack of knowledge. Now, when my husband was in that glorious situation to enter an RCT after being diagnosed, that was, well, I guess it was, I don't know how to phrase it properly. It was a rude awakening and probably the wake-up call of my life. Because being exposed to this wonderful new world of evidence generation was one of the most horrendous experiences of our life. And I have a quote from a patient there that comes later on, who likens these trials as the 21st equivalent of medieval torture. And I do not think that this is the way how we should be doing science. Why is this a problem, and why was this such a problem? The thing is that if you have breakthrough therapy, something that makes a significant step over existing therapies, and in the end, this is all what we're hoping for. We don't want incremental progress. We want solutions to our problems. The standard way of RCTs will give us an inferior comparator nearly immediately. Melanoma had a series of these trials, and everyone knows from the beginning of entering these trials that there is a chance of ending up on something that we knew never worked. And that experience, while you can get your head around having a fatal diagnosis, knowing that there's something that could give you maybe not life, but at least time, and not getting it out of man-made conditions, is inhuman. And I do not think that we as society, as a developed society, should tolerate that. In the next step, people give us good data and they tell us whether drugs work and whether they're safe. And I would like to challenge you on that point. Because if you have a huge, if the effect size is huge, that leads to very small trials, which allows to very cleanly select the trial population that goes on the trial, which limits then the external validity of the trial. If you as a patient have brain mets and melanoma, and 80% of our patients do at death, and you looked at the earliest data, brain mets were systematically excluded from trials. What does that tell you about the trial? How relevant is it to our real problem, namely the real world? It is limited. Safety. The new immunotherapies are one of the terrors of pharmacovigilance people because these trials are small. It is pure statistics that if you test something in 500 people, you won't pick up rare side effects. Even 1,000 people is not enough. So we need something that is better on the pharmacovigilance side. So what we get told, and it is totally understandable, that we as healthy individuals would like to believe that there is a fantastic system in place that tests our drugs, that they work like a charm, that they're safe, and of course have no side effects whatsoever, and that it will be available the day we become the patient. But we are not there yet. So this is actually the quote that I had there. So I think there is a huge room for improvement And it's a step that we have to take. And the oddest thing in there that it now seems to be the financial side of things that is driving it. Because it is not only delivering, it is not only inhumane to patients, it is also costly. And luckily for us as patients, and I actually see it as a luck or as a, I don't know, maybe it is the situation we had to get to for the system really to change, that we have to come up to better data. This is the quote I mentioned earlier on. And this is a stage 4 patient who's been through quite a lot actually. She's progressing at the moment. And she puts it very concretely. First, you're told your mole is nothing to worry about. Then you're told it's going to kill you. Then we have a drug that could help you, but you're not going to get it. And what we as patients need is not just some data, something on efficacy. We need something that tells us, does it work in the real world? And actually, can we afford it? And if we can't at the moment, we need a system that changes that. And I believe that different types of evidence generation and real-world data is, I agree, is very ill-defined because it harbors so many different groups. And as we have heard very eloquently, you have to select the right tool for the right situation. But I believe like the unifying theme for me is that real-world data is about external validity. RCT is about internal validity. Real-world data addresses the question of external validity. As patients, you have to know what works for someone like you and something that you can actually extrapolate from. So this slide I borrowed from a speaker who's coming later. Thank you very much for that, Sarah. But I believe that we have to move upwards on that ladder and as fast as possible because our people continue to die. And with that, I would like to end with a quote from a famous American. Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. Actually, he probably said inhuman, because if you go digging into the quote, I started reading up on it, he said it at a conference in 1966. And it was a comment he made, it was never written down, it was not part of a speech. And it is mostly cited as inhumane, but what he really said was inhuman. And I think this is where we are. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Bettina, you used 15 minutes, so we're going to move on. I didn't want to stop you. You were in flow. You were going well. So we're going to proceed now to our last speaker. This is Artie Rai, who's the Evelyn R. Lattery Professor of Law at Duke University. Thank you very much for being here. Let me pull up your slide.
Okay. So this is a Mac? Good.
It is, yes.
Awesome, because I'm using a Mac.
I'm very happy you like it.
Yes. I can use my presenter view,
Thank you.
which
if there's anybody here from the Apple Corporation, that's a sarcastic comment.
I'm just going to do one thing, which is presenter view. All right. Excellent. So I am the last speaker, and I'm following 3 very eloquent speakers, so I will try to be brief. I am also speaking on a topic that probably is not going to elicit the same level of passion, I suspect, in many of you as the prior speakers did, and that is the question of how commercial rights fit into all of this, in particular intellectual property broadly defined. That is not, unfortunately, necessarily a very exciting topic, but at the end of the day, it's a topic that will determine whether the therapy gets to market, and that's the unfortunate reality of the situation. And so I think it's very important to speak about it. I'll speak about it in the particular context of clinical trial data. As our prior speaker so eloquently pointed out, of course, there are many things wrong with clinical trial data, and I absolutely agree on that score. That said, it does provide a case study of the ways in which intellectual property ownership generally gets really complex when you're trying to figure out how to use data to actually get a therapy to market. I happen also to have served on an Institute of Medicine committee that looked specifically at clinical trial data sharing and mechanisms by which sharing of clinical trial data might be used to get therapies to market. Now, the focus of that particular committee, that Institute of Medicine committee, the focus was more on perhaps what you might call auditing pharmaceutical companies. As we all know, the history of pharmaceutical companies with respect to revealing truly the results of their clinical trial data with respect to approved drugs has not always been stellar. That said, my particular interest in clinical trial data sharing is on trying to come up with new innovations from that data sharing. And that's true for data sharing in general, but I'll speak about clinical trial data sharing because this is an area where some of us have put in a fair amount of thought. I think in the context of real-world data, as Ken calls it, it's even harder. So I'll certainly can speak in the Q&A about what IP/commercialization/ownership issues might come up, but that's even harder. So let me start with something a little bit simpler, where we have some if you will, real-world evidence of how commercialization and IP work. So I do think clinical trial data, both on approved drugs and on drugs that actually failed, could be valuable sources of evidence for new uses new uses either of approved drugs or of drugs that never made it. As I mentioned, I was on this clinical trial data sharing committee that the Institute of Medicine organized, and as the title of the report from January, this past January, indicates, there are many benefits to sharing clinical trial data, and I would expand data generally. But there are risks, and the risks that I will focus on, others have focused on risks to privacy, potential, other types of risks. The risks I will focus on may seem less exciting in certain ways, and it may seem purely financial, quote unquote, but it's actually also a risk ultimately to patients, because if there is no financial value to be gained from a particular set of data, that data is likely not to get to market. That's just, again, the cold reality of the situation. So the risk that pharmaceutical companies focus on is typically risk to patents. If you talk to most pharmaceutical company patent lawyers, and I never worked for a pharmaceutical company, but I am a recovering patent lawyer, and now I teach law. They will, sharing is a dirty word in some respects, because sharing means compromising patents or perhaps data exclusivity. We'll talk about that other regime of data exclusivity in just a minute. But it's not simple financial value. For them, maybe it might be, but as I said, it can also be health value, because if the therapy doesn't make it to market, if no one wants to invest in it because there's no patent to be had, then that's health value lost as well. Now, I don't want to be all gloom and doom about it. Oftentimes, you see pharmaceutical patent lawyers being all gloom and doom about data sharing. So in the orange, I've put out, I'm sure Hans-Georg has heard this many times from various pharmaceutical patent lawyers, all the parade of horribles that could happen. And I'll talk about that a little bit, but I also think that data sharing can lead to new opportunities, and not simply new opportunities for health, although that's what I care about, but also financial value, which is what will drive those therapies to market. So let me talk about that a little bit in three contexts. One is the context, well, two contexts involved approved drugs, so drugs that have already been approved, and the question is, how can sharing clinical trial data on those drugs help patients and also help therapies get to market? The other is data sharing associated with abandoned drugs, and in particular, I've worked a little bit with NIH's National Center for Advancing Translational Science, which has been doing a lot of work on clinical trial data sharing and abandoned drugs. So let's start with approved drugs, and we'll start with voluntary sharing. The voluntary sharing that I will focus on simply because I heard a lot about it at the IOM committee and also know some of the people who are involved, is the data sharing that was pioneered really by GSK, but now 12 different pharmaceutical companies are involved, and that's the clinical data sharing repository, where full data and metadata, anonymized, are available from 12 of our pharmaceutical sponsors This data remains on an access system, so there's no downloading. That said, academics and others who are approved by an independent review committee can get access to the data, and not necessarily now, but in the not too distant future, there will be the ability not simply to get data from one sponsor, but also aggregate that data with data from other sponsors, as I understand it. That's the goal. Again, remaining on that system so that there's no downloading for reasons that we'll talk about related to commercial value, but and perhaps also privacy, but that's the voluntary system that we have currently in the major voluntary system we have currently in the US. The data sharing agreement in that CDSR that I have read now several times is fairly straightforward, and it's pretty clear that the data remains confidential information. There's no transfer to third parties without approval. And there's interesting and I think important language with respect to new IP that might be generated. In other words, new uses, subgroups that might be found by looking at the data for which new uses might be possible, other new IP that might be generated, maybe combinations of drugs, what have you. There's a right of first refusal to an exclusive license to whoever is working on the data. So the features of this are pretty strict contractual protection of the information, and because all of the data remains on the access system, this is a SaaS system that's been set up, it can't be used, it can't be downloaded to support what are known as marketing authorizations, which are mechanisms by which people get approval. And the concern is that if data could be downloaded, irresponsible entities or misappropriators could get marketing approval without the consent of the generator of the data. So in terms of new IP, it does allow for new uses. This particular voluntary sharing model does allow for new uses to be the subject of IP protection. And I do think that even though it is to some extent a closed system in that you have to apply for access and be approved in order to enter this system, it definitely allows many more eyes on the data. So more eyes, in the words of Eric Raymond, one of the pioneers of thinking about open source, more eyeballs mean that all bugs are shallow, and I think we will see, as a consequence, progress. So I think this is good. It's a good voluntary system. I do look forward to the time when data from different sponsors can be integrated, because that is, one key piece of the puzzle, I think, as Hans-Georg mentioned earlier. There are, unfortunately, with respect to approved drugs, some limitations, at least in the US. I'm less clear on other countries, but at least in the US, some limitations on the value of new use patents that we can talk about in the Q&A. So this is a problem, I think, that has to be fixed in the IP system if we're going to have this data be used on approved drugs, be used in a manner that generates new uses. Companies will tell you that use patents on new uses of approved drugs are useless. They will tell you that flat out, and therefore they don't care about new uses of approved drugs. So we got to come up with a way to fix that problem, and I have some ideas. We can talk about it in the Q&A. I'm not going to talk too much about mandatory disclosure, because that was to some extent discussed this morning by Hans-Georg and others. The EMA has a policy, as many of you know, where data on approved drugs will be made available automatically, mandatorily, if you will. There will be on-screen access for any user, and as a consequence, this is much more public than the CSDR model, and downloadable CSRs for identified users, and that is a potential issue with respect to people using CSRs for marketing or authorizations in other countries. So again, we can talk about that in the Q&A. One thing that I think is very interesting about the EMA's definition of what constitutes confidential information is that it includes information on essentially new uses. I mean, it's described in the language of exploratory endpoints, but it's basically new uses. And I think that's actually a good thing that that's considered confidential information, because if, under the laws of most jurisdictions, information about a new use is out in the public domain, no one can patent it, and even though new use patents aren't necessarily that helpful, as we just discussed, they're better than nothing. And so I do think that this is a good step on the part of the EMA to exclude new use information from what is made publicly available, or exploratory endpoints, as they put it. For reasons of time, I'll skip over the whole marketing authorization question. That can get really in the weeds, and I don't necessarily want to do that unless that's of interest to people. I will skip to what I think is the biggest opportunity with respect to sharing of clinical trial data, and that's on abandoned drugs. Most drugs, as we know, are abandoned. They fail. Only 10% of compounds entering phase 2 pass into phase 3. And here, I think there really is valuable IP protection to be had, because in this case, new use patents, because there's no possibility of off-label use for these abandoned drugs, can basically serve as the equivalent of a composition of matter patent, which is a really strong patent that you need to get a therapy to market. NCATS, with which I've worked to some extent, has been doing some neat work, basically trying to maintain IP protection while also getting many academic eyes on the problem of this abandoned clinical trial data. And there's already been one nice result from an AstraZeneca drug that had previously been abandoned. It's gone through phase 1 now for brain function, potential brain function uses. It's an FYN kinase that was previously thought to be a cancer drug, failed on efficacy for those grounds, but now might have some promise in the brain function space. Here, if this works out, there'll be a strong use patent associated with it because of the way that NIH has set up the ability to maintain confidentiality while still having many eyes on the problem. And so I applaud them for that, and I think this is a real model for thinking about rescue drugs in general, which I think is a really underutilized space in terms of trying to do drug discovery cost effectively. These are compounds that have already gone through some level of safety screening, and then they just are abandoned and lie fallow if they're not rescued in some way. So I've gone through a lot, and I've gone over my time. I've gone over my time. So if you're interested in these questions, I've written 2 different articles on the questions, and you're welcome to, the slides will be available so you can look at the references. Thanks.
Thank you very much. If I could have all the speakers up on the stage, please. And we'd like to open up, for the last 15 minutes, we'd like to open up the floor for Q&A. Does anybody have any questions? I've got about 40 that I'll happily go through, but if there's anyone out here, you make my job easier, please. All right, thank you. Please say your name and where you're from, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Ed Pizzala. I work for Aetna. I have a question for this panel, but probably folks from some of the other panels might want to chime into this as well. A lot of what we've discussed today in terms of let's get the drug to market faster, we're not as worried about risk because the patients who are going to take this drug are severely ill and are going to die. Or, let's, move, something through a little more quickly. And we can, and I totally understand, and I think that we all understand that for patients who have fatal diseases and diseases that cause rapid decline, that they have a different benefit-risk sort of approach to it than people who have other diseases. But the biggest issue we have here in the States, and I think that it's an issue in other places as well, is physician autonomy. Doctors can write for that drug for anything once it gets into the marketplace, and this is a serious problem. We don't really have controls on making sure that the drug gets to the population for which it's intended, and as a result, the regulators are really pretty conservative more conservative than many patient advocacy groups would like to see, because their concern is what happens when this drug starts to get out there and I no longer have any control. The FDA no longer has control over how a doctor uses a medicine. If it's the right kind of patient, in other words, doctors can experiment. And so, how are we going to handle that?
Yeah, thank you. I think, Ken, I pretty...
Okay, the problem really reduces to the following. If we're talking about MAPS or adaptive licensing, we're talking about controls on initial use of the drug, so that during the period when uncertainty is great, those taking the drug are those with the most beneficial benefit-risk ratio. And it's not because you know something bad's going to happen, but you know that you don't know. The control that I would recommend puts people like Ed Pizzella and Aetna on the spot. In the United States, drugs are kind of expensive at times, and most people don't want to pay for it out of their pockets. And the issue of what an insurer is willing to pay for can exercise or have some effect on people's behavior. Now, the effect on behavior would not be perfect. It would not be the same as an absolute control, and people that are really determined could go ahead and take it, and the people could experiment. But as long as you obtain information on the results of that experimentation and it feeds back into the system, I'm not that upset about it. If people are informed of the uncertainty, decide to take it, and pay a bundle for it, that's not such a bad outcome if they value it.
The big problem from my standpoint, we do a lot of data work. Obviously, we're doing some work on repurposing with a couple biotech companies. The big problem is you don't capture that data. If it's off-label, you don't get the data. You don't know what the impact is. That's the biggest problem. We're not getting the valuable data. Yes, please.
And wouldn't you have to require the script to say what use it's being put for?
Not necessarily.
Yes,
you can get that, but then you might not get the data afterwards if it's off-label. It might just be you just know there was a script.
That's what I mean. And so I think that it's very difficult, even in your scenario, Ken, to absolutely be clear that the population that should get the only population that gets the drug is the one which is indicated.
See, I'm not even that upset if it isn't, at the end of the day, totally restricted, as long as people are informed.
Well, how do you regulate that, though?
That's a problem.
But it's not our problem. You both want to chime in, so let's go to Sabine first.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at the different safeguards we have on off-label use, and your first, the different national systems come to have different provisions on how off-label use can be allowed and applied. So that is only possible if there are no therapeutic alternatives in some jurisdictions. A second important element is that off-label use now under EU legislation is considered as something which needs to be reported to the regulators. So the extent of off-label use needs to be reported. So the system is starting to be more, keeping more oversight on the off-label use and the experiences with it in the future under the pharmacovigilance legislation.
Do the German registries capture the data?
Pardon?
Do the German registries capture that off-label use data?
The registries, not necessarily, but it is an obligation for the companies to report the off-label use, and they need to get the data, of course, from the different prescribers.
Bettina, you wanted to come in.
I do think that to the proper usage or the appropriate usage of a new drug, I think medical societies play an enormous role in the development of guidelines. And there are some countries that have their own guidelines, which are often based on existing or on guidelines, and they will only reimburse treatment according to guidelines. I think that this is the largest part, because we start focusing on off-label while the largest proportion of patients will be treated within or on-label. So I think on-label guidelines play an enormous role. And then off-label, if we capture the data, I think it is a way of hypothesis generation, which from a patient perspective, I think is beneficial.
Another question. Anyone? Yes, in the back. Dave Dvorak.
Yeah, Dave Dvorak, Oracle. Just a bit of a question. We hear a lot about the pharma companies allegedly not sharing data. I'm going to take a little bit of a different perspective. In the work that we're doing within the Oracle environment, we do a lot of work with hospitals and healthcare systems, as well as with life science companies, CROs, and pharma. And what we're finding is that the differences between those two is getting smaller and smaller, narrower and narrower, where what actually happens at the bedside is turning into directive to the medicinal chemist in the pharma company that drives back to a bedside outcome measure. But what we're also finding is that the vast majority of academic institutions run boatloads of investigator-initiated studies, which some of them get into information, some of them get published, some of them don't. Some of them are really crappy science, some of them are pretty good. And what we also found is that just overall, those institutions simply don't want to share access to their boatloads of real live patient data. And if they do have some, it's sketchy at best, and it's not longitudinal, it's not, certainly not discrete data. There's lots of information tucked into an investigator note. It's hard to get information out in its first place. So when you start thinking about sharing data and the convergence between what's going on at the bench to the bedside and that feedback loop, I'm sort of curious what your thoughts are in regards to how do we really start getting more information
challenges. Originally, when looking to develop drug diagnostic combinations, there was a culture clash between drug developers and those who developed the lab tests that were used to target drugs. I remember, I've been here for about 10 years, and I remember at the very beginning having diagnostic companies talk to me about how pharma companies just didn't understand them and were trying to put them out of business. So one of the first activities PMC did was bring those two the groups together and just have them understand each other. The pharmaceutical industry has since grown to understand it needs a strong, vibrant, creative, internationally reaching diagnostics industry to support new drugs. And why is that? At first, there was Gleevec. Then there was Herceptin. And every year we'd have one or none, or in a good year, two. In 2014, 9 of FDA's new drugs, 20% of the new drugs to market were personalized medicines. That's an incredible percentage, a sizable minority. In casual conversations with FDA, of course they can't guarantee it, but they're seeing in drug reviews about 1 in 5 candidates for new medicines are targeted. And so this percentage is likely to continue. Why is that important? Once a drug is proved to be effective, which is hard enough, it then has to be covered and paid for. And in the US, there are many different private plans, and they all require different levels of evidence to make these decisions. And then obviously we have CMS that makes public paying decisions for American citizens, but their policies also greatly influence how the diagnostic tests or therapeutics are covered and paid for. And both of those organizations are under the umbrella of the Department of Health and Human Services. And when I sit back and think about the challenges to the concept of personalized medicine, I'm always struck by the dichotomy between the excitement in FDA, the excitement among the drug reviewers, the excitement with the diagnostics reviewers, their pride when they bring a personalized medicine to market, when it's for an extremely targeted, narrow population, and magic is seen. My first research methods class professor always said, if you find magic, you don't need a really large sample size, and that's what he called a statistically valid effect, magic. And when you see a disease state like cystic fibrosis, that was a near-death sentence, and now for 35% of the population, just in 2014, 2015, new drugs that are treating these patients. And the science has advanced so much that we may get new therapies to treat other subsets of cystic fibrosis. That's exciting. That is incredibly exciting. But there are challenges. Again, our entire healthcare system was developed using a one-size-fits-all model. A CF drug is a CF drug. It goes to everyone. A breast cancer drug is a breast cancer drug. It goes to everyone. But that's not the case anymore. And Dr. Esselman did a very great outline in one disease state about all that goes into getting a drug to market and how scientists think about getting these things done, which is an incredible challenge. Now, after we get a drug through FDA, and then after we get it covered and paid for, well, before I go to the next step, let me just dive a little deeper into the coverage and pay for part. The diagnostics industry, the cornerstone of personalized medicine, the industry that helps patients choose best treatments, be it therapy, be it surgery, be it a medicine, is constantly challenged by coverage and payment decisions. I've seen incredible cuts to the industry, incredible challenges to the industry over the last 3 to 5 years, incredible challenges, and they're continuing today. So one evolution I've seen in the business side challenge is seeing the pharmaceutical industry finally understand that having that strong diagnostics community is part of their responsibility, and they need to be a partner in that. Okay, so after you get through coverage and payment, then integration needs to happen into the healthcare system. What do I mean by that? Physicians are trained and they practice medicine. Many continue to keep up with the evolving science, but the science in personalized medicine evolves fast. Once a drug's on the market for a targeted population, Research continues to expand the indications. Like Dr. Esserman, I don't know if you heard her say it, but once they're on the market, we can learn how to best use them in clinical care. And that's what happens. We learn how to best use them in clinical care. We saw an example of how the data needs to be aligned, but that's a mammoth undertaking. And we can get to that future, but more importantly, we need a healthcare workforce that is conversant with the topics of personalized medicines, comfortable with doing a or many diagnostic tests before going into treatment, explaining to patients this will likely work for you because it doesn't work for everyone, but it does work for a subset and you are part of that subset. That's very exciting. And we've had a lot of different examples of personalized medicine or personalized medicine diagnostics into the field and get challenged at the integration level. So this remains a considerable challenge, but having the healthcare system evolve along with the science of personalized medicine will help us get there sooner. Now, the title is Implementing Personalized Medicine, Determining Economic Value. And before closing, I just wanted to reflect on the word value, if you'll indulge me. It's a word that means many things to many people. And there are conversations about the concept of value. And just this year, I've come to fully appreciate, I think, the term. So I just want to share with you some of the values of personalized medicines that I've noticed in my work recently. So when a patient receives a transplanted heart, the new heart in the new body needs to be followed for some time to make sure the body isn't rejecting it. And the way that usually was done was heart biopsy, which is an invasive hospital-based procedure where a piece of the heart is taken out and goes through pathology testing, and then healthcare follows on that. There is a test that can replace heart biopsy. It's in clinical care guidelines. It's an amazing example of a value. Would you like to have a heart biopsy or a blood test? And if you're a right candidate for that diagnostic, you personally can see the value. As members of the healthcare system, you can see the value that brings to that patient. There's also the ability to live a normal life while fighting disease. Non-small cell lung cancer, the non-smoker's cancer, is a very difficult to treat disease. And yet, in the last 5, 7, or 8 years, depending on how you count, maybe 10, we've seen incredible advances in understanding the biomarker of lung cancer tumors and how to target treatment to them. So you should probably, if you're diagnosed with non-small cell lung cancer, the first thing that should be done is diagnostic testing to determine if a targeted treatment is right for you. Yet 25%, a full 25% of non-small cell lung cancer patients are receiving diagnostic testing before treatment. And the reason why this is a problem, aside from not getting a targeted drug that may have an incredible impact on your disease state, is that oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, it's a better quality of life for the patient. They can take the drug at home rather than going to a doctor's office. Oftentimes, targeted therapeutics have less toxic side effects, and a person can continue to work and raise their family. And that's a value we need to understand. We also need to understand these drugs don't go to absolutely everyone. They only go to the ones who it will work for. And when we're talking about a disease state where we're seeing the science rapidly evolve, there's also value in understanding if I get a little more life, I can make it to the next clinical trial. And it was a patient who said that. She was on a targeted drug that did stop working for her. Another one came into clinical trial that crossed the blood-brain barrier, and she got 2 more years of acute response to that therapeutic. And she says, on average, people get 6 months benefit. I got 2 years on this. I'm 45 years old. I have 2 daughters. So my 2 years matters. And it matters times 3, me, the 2 girls. And it just made me realize all she wants is 6 months because she's assuming or hoping, probably even praying, that the pharmaceutical industry is going to get something new in the pipeline for her to try. So I would argue that too is a value, seeing that evolution of therapeutic classes, seeing just getting a little more life until you can get into that next clinical trial. So unlike drugs in the last century, personalized medicines are only given to those who will truly benefit from them. And that's going to mean we need to drastically recreate the healthcare system. So Dr. Esserman did a really good job of explaining the science of discovery. We've heard a lot of enthusiasm from the FDA in getting drug diagnostic combination products out to market using the breakthrough therapy designation. We've seen a lot of very interesting ideas coming from payers on modeling pathways in ways that could benefit patients if done correctly, or could stifle and halt the uptake of innovations. And we've talked about the healthcare workforce and education. I would also argue that patients today are a little more enthusiastic about owning their health care. And when they see someone they know benefiting from a personalized medicine, they question why personalized medicine isn't the way of all health care. If we have 20% of new drugs coming to market in 2014 being targeted, and that continues, we really are going to have to make these fundamental changes sooner better than later. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Amy. Now, keeping the same theme, we're going to go across the pond and get the perspective from Richard Barker from Catapult. He's going to tell us about its Catapult from CASME. So, thank you very much.
I have two roles, Joe, yes, as director of CASME and also as chairman of the Precision Medicine Catapult. And thank you very much, Dwayne, Joe, and our sponsors for enabling us to be here. It's great to be back in this room. I was last in it about 20 years ago. It hasn't changed. It's just as fantastic. So if you don't want to listen to me, have a look at the ceiling. It's fantastic. But I'd like to just underscore some of the things that have come out today by telling a very brief story. In Alaska, in Anchorage, Alaska, there is the Lundfeldt family. And a few years ago, they had their first child. They christened him Cameron. And Alyssa Lundfeldt was obviously very proud right at the beginning. But unfortunately, the child didn't thrive, didn't meet its development goals, or his development goals, and started to turn gray, eyes rolled back in the head, listless, and so on. Took the child to first the emergency room and lots of other specialists. Ultimately, Cameron was diagnosed as the youngest patient with diabetes, type 1 diabetes, in the whole of Alaska. So what's happening now? Is he injecting insulin 3 times a day, watching his food? No. Because someone in the mix said, hey, juvenile diabetes at that kind of stage may well have a genetic component. And so there was a connection made between Anchorage, Alaska and University of Chicago, where they had been doing some leading work, and also with the University of Exeter in the UK, where they'd also been identifying a particular genetic abnormality called KCNJ11. And the child was tested for this, and turned out that was the variant that his genome had. The interesting thing here, and there may be a diabetologist in the audience, in which case I should shut up, but the child's pancreas makes plenty of insulin. The beta cells are full of insulin, it just can't get out. The transport mechanism doesn't work. And all you need to do is give a simple oral drug, a sulfonylurea, and that insulin comes out and the child is normal. So instead of injections several times a day, and you can imagine all the healthcare costs and time and agony associated with that for the rest of his life, he just takes a simple oral pill. And that seems to me to be a story that has got a number of elements to it. I mean, the first thing it does is really reinforce the point that we are entering an era of precision medicine based on those kinds of molecular insights that fundamentally transforms the way we define disease. And I think Hans-Georg made that point earlier today, but I just want to underline it. we still talk about the diseases defined by symptoms. In fact, in practice, we're going to be defining them molecularly. Goodness knows what medical training is going to look like then. We probably have to reword almost all of our slides because we're talking about very specific molecular defects with very specific therapies. It also brings together pharmaceuticals, diagnostics, and informatics in ways that have never been converged before. Amy made these points tremendously powerfully. 3 different industries, or there's probably more than 3 different industries, have to come together to make this work. It's also a movement able to bring interventions much earlier in our lives, not perhaps just when disease symptoms appear, as they did in the case of Cameron, but you've all probably read about Human Longevity and Arivale. These are companies being set up to actually sequence people right at the beginning of their lives or as soon as they go on the program, anticipate the disease, and take preventive measures that mean the disease never actually appears. So personalized or precision medicine becomes precision prevention in time. But the other thing that the Cameron story reminds me of is that these insights are actually able to re-engineer care pathways and workflows in quite fundamental ways. And that's really important. And in a minute, we're going to listen to Mark, who's going to tell us the solution to the economic problem. But I think part of the solution to the economic problem is to recognize those places where these technologies fundamentally simplify and rationalize the processes of care, not just from the point of view of the patient, but from the point of view of the workflow within the hospital and throughout. And therefore, I think precision medicine is crucial to making healthcare itself sustainable. About 4 or 5 years ago, I wrote a book that said avoiding a medical meltdown, because I think we see that in so many of the healthcare systems of the world. Certainly in the UK, it's running out of money really fast. And what we have to do is not present precision medicine to these kinds of folks as extra expense, but as a way of revolutionizing the way in which care is delivered and actually making it fundamentally sustainable. But I think a number of other things that the Cameron story doesn't reinforce, but have come up today. Firstly, that precision medicine is central to this idea of adaptive development, adaptive pathways, accelerated pathways. Without that ability to target, we can't do some of this adaptive thinking, adaptive mindset that Hans-Georg and others have talked about, and Sabine really elegantly laid out. It enables, indeed I believe it demands what Laura was telling us about new clinical trial designs. Without precision medicine, we can't do those trial designs. They don't make sense. Now they do. And of course, it makes sense, as Ken was telling us, of all this real-world data if we can just ensure its reliability. The Precision Medicine Catapult, by the way, is a UK initiative to grow the industry of precision medicine. Now, some of you may react against, as I initially did, this idea of an industry. But when you add up pharmaceuticals, diagnostics, informatics, data analytics, this is actually an emerging industry, and what we want to do is grow it in the UK, but to do it with international collaborations. Laura and I have already tried to address the fact that I didn't see the UK shaded in on your charts, so we need, the French were and the Germans were, so obviously we need to get your travel itinerary worked out. Because we have in fact done the 100,000 Genome Project, and breast cancer is one of the key elements of the 100,000 Genome Project. So there'll be thousands of patients for which we have the whole genome sequence and can put them in. I think what I'd like to do in just the last few seconds is to throw the challenge back to Mark that he's going to address, right? I knew you'd needed that. The economic value question, I think, is central to this. And Amy made the point extremely powerfully. You know, if you're a diagnostic lab director and somebody comes along and says, how would you like to spend another few hundred or few $1,000s on this test? Of course you don't. Somehow or other, you have to find the person who has a view of the total care pathway and says, actually, if you use this test, even if it's $10,000, it might save $50,000 in useless therapeutics. So what we have to do is get the economic models moving as fast as the science, which I'm sure is something that Mark is absolutely equal to, with regard to the therapeutics value, the diagnostics value, and the value of the changes in the care pathway that we need to see. So pricing and payment, I think, will increasingly be the themes that precision medicine has to tackle. Thanks very much.
Really great. That was terrific. Thank you, Richard. So as we've just been promised, Mark is going to come up and explain how all of this is going to get fixed and how we're going to pay for all of it. Mark is the executive director at the executive in residence, excuse me, at MIT.
I never leave, I always sleep. And Richard, thank you. You said you would set me up for the final talk of the day, and I think you set me up royally. So thank you very much for all of that. I'm your last speaker for the day, and I have the job of not only addressing some of the issues, but making you love economics along the way, since that's my role here today. So before we think about the value, the economic value of stratified, personalized, precision targeted, or otherwise named medicines, I thought we'd think for just a moment, very briefly, about what did we think of success in the empirical, the old days, right? And one of the best examples that we often tout is how the cardiovascular disease rates have fallen over the past 10, 20, 30 years. And this has been a fantastic success as we think about this. And as you look at that, statins, while only part of the solution for that, played an important role. They were empirically prescribed to those who display certain risk factors. And the real objective was to avoid one fatal event by giving the drug to persons off on average for 5 years. You could expect to avoid an event, but not for the one person. You had to give it to 83 people, right? We just didn't know which of the 83 was going to avoid the fatal heart attack. All right? So if you treated 83 people for 5 years, right, and the cost or price of the drug